Look into a mirror made before the year 1880, and you are looking at something stranger than you know. Not the glass, not the silvered back, the substance that made the reflection possible in the first place. Because almost every fine mirror produced in the Western world before that year traces back to a single supply of mercury, one source, one channel of trade, one bottleneck through which the entire reflective surface of the modern world had to pass. And in the year 1881, the foundry at the centre of that trade burned to the ground in a single night, taking its ledgers, formulas and workers with it. The official record calls it an accident. The numbers tell a different story. Tonight we are going to follow the mercury, we are going to follow the money, and we are going to ask why an industry worth a fortune allowed its most important building to vanish in flame, and then quietly rebuilt itself somewhere else, under a different name, with a different process, as if it wanted the old way forgotten. This is not a story about ghosts in the glass. It is a story about supply, about monopoly, about the way a handful of merchants can hold the whole of an industry in their hands and squeeze. It is the story of how mirrors, the most ordinary objects in any home, were once among the most tightly controlled luxury goods on earth, and how the people who controlled them guarded their secret with the same care as state guards a mint. Before we go further, if you find these forgotten corners of economic history as fascinating as I do, take 1 second to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who never learned them in school, and it tells me to keep digging into the records that the textbooks skip. That one tap keeps this work alive. Now, let us begin where every mirror begins, with a poison. Mercury is a metal that behaves like a liquid. It runs, it pools, it slips through the fingers, and it kills slowly and certainly anyone who works with it for too long. For more than 300 years it sat at the heart of mirror making. The method was called the tin mercury process, and it produced a reflection of a depth and clarity that the cheaper methods of later years never quite matched. A sheet of tin foil was laid flat, liquid mercury was poured across it until the surface shimmered like still water. Then a pane of glass was slid over the top, the excess metal pressed out, and weight set down for weeks while the mercury and tin bonded into a soft, bright amalgam clinging to the back of the glass. The result was the looking glass of the old aristocracy, warm, slightly golden, almost alive. But here is the thing the old craft histories tend to leave out. Tin was everywhere. Glass could be made in 100 cities. The one ingredient that could not be improvised, could not be substituted, and could not be found in most of Europe in any useful quantity, was the mercury itself. And mercury, in the quantities an industry needed, came from almost nowhere. There are only a few places on the surface of the planet where mercury collects in concentrations rich enough to mine at scale. The ore is called cinnabar, a heavy red rock that the ancients ground into the pigment they called vermilion. Roast cinnabar in a furnace and the mercury boils out as vapour, then condenses back into shining liquid in the cooling pipes. For most of recorded European history, the great wellspring of that liquid was a single mine in what is now Slovenia, at a town called Idrija, and an even greater one in Spain, at Almaden, in the dry hills south of the capital. Together these two mines supplied the overwhelming majority of the mercury that the Western world ever touched. Almaden was the larger and the older. Its galleries had been worked since Roman times, and by the height of the early modern period it had become one of the most valuable single assets owned by the Spanish crown. The Spanish needed mercury not only for mirrors, but for something far more lucrative. Mercury was the key to extracting silver from the ore of the New World. The method, called amalgamation, used mercury to pull pure silver out of crushed rock, and that silver was the foundation of an empire. So the crown took the mine into its own hands and held it like a treasure. Production was counted, sealed, and shipped under guard. Anyone caught diverting mercury faced ruin or worse. Now follow the logic of that situation, because it is the hinge on which our entire story turns. If a single state controls the world's supply of a substance, and that substance is the one irreplaceable ingredient in two enormously profitable industries, then whoever sits closest to that supply controls both industries by extension. The silver flowed where the crown wished it to flow, and the mercury that was left over, the portion not consumed by the silver mines, flowed through a narrow set of merchant houses who had bought the right to distribute it. These houses did not make mirrors. They did something far cleverer. They sold the only thing that could. Idriga played the same role on the other side of the continent. For centuries it answered to the Habsburgs in Vienna, and its mercury fed the workshops of the German states, of Venice, and of the looking-glass makers who would later cluster in France. The two mines, Spanish and Austrian, were rivals on paper. But the men who traded their output learned, as men in such positions always learn, that they made more money cooperating than competing. They learned to set a price together. They learned to release only so much into the market each year. And they learned to keep that arrangement very, very quiet. This is the part that the polite histories of glassmaking skip almost entirely. They will tell you about Venetian secrets and French espionage and the great mirror hall built for a king. They will rarely tell you that beneath all of it sat a mercury cartel, and that the price of every mirror in every drawing room was set not by the glassmaker, not by the craftsman who risked his lungs over the amalgam, but by a handful of men who never touched a pane in their lives. To understand how valuable that control was, you have to understand what a mirror cost. In the centuries when the tin mercury method ruled, a large clear-looking glass could cost more than a painting by a master. It could cost more than a small house. A single mirror in the grand gallery of a palace represented a sum that an ordinary labourer could not have earned in a lifetime of work. Mirrors were not decoration. They were stored wealth displayed on the wall the way a man might display gold. The reason was partly the difficulty of making flat, clear glass before modern machinery, and partly the danger of the silvering, but it was just as much the artificial scarcity of the materials. When a cartel controls the input, it does not price the product at the cost of making it. It prices the product at the highest figure the buyer can be made to bear, and the buyers, the nobility and the rising merchant class who wanted to imitate the nobility, could bear a great deal. The Venetians understood this better than anyone. On the island of Murano, the glassmakers of the Republic perfected the art of the mirror and then locked it away behind law. The masters of Murano were forbidden to leave the Republic and carry their knowledge abroad. A craftsman who fled could expect agents sent after him, and the histories record more than one who died in strange circumstances on foreign soil after accepting the invitation of a rival court. The Republic was not protecting an art for art's sake. It was protecting a revenue stream. The mirror trade was a pillar of the Venetian treasury, and the secret of the amalgam was treated as a state asset, just as Almaden treated its ore. For a time it worked beautifully. Venice sold mirrors across Europe at prices that made the Republic rich. Then came the famous acts of industrial theft, when agents working for the French crown smuggled Murano craftsmen out of the lagoon and into France to staff a new royal manufacture. The story is usually told as a triumph of espionage, and it was. But notice what it did to the structure underneath. It did not abolish the monopoly. It moved it. France now made its own mirrors. The Great Hall of Glass was built to advertise the achievement to the world, and a new royal manufacture took its place in the chain. The craft had been stolen, but the mercury had not. The mercury still came from the same two mines. The men who sat on the supplies simply gained another large customer. This is the pattern you must hold in your mind as we move toward the fire. Every shift in the history of mirrors that the textbooks present as progress, as the spread of a craft, as the democratizing march of a luxury becoming common, sat on top of a supply chain that never truly opened. The faces at the top changed. The choke point did not. And a choke point by its nature generates enormous profit for whoever holds it, right up until the moment something threatens to remove it. In the middle of the 19th century, something did. It is worth pausing to see just how tightly that supply could be held, because the 19th century gives us a clear and documented example that throws light backward onto the whole murky history. For a long stretch of that century, the marketing of the mercury from the great Spanish mine at Almaden was placed in the hands of a single banking house, one of the most powerful financial dynasties in Europe. That house did not own the mine. It did something more elegant. It secured the exclusive right to sell the mine's output, and then it worked to bring the rival Austrian source into the same orderly arrangement, so that the two great wellsprings of the world's mercury would no longer undercut one another, but would instead move in step, releasing a measured amount each year at a price the two of them agreed upon. This is the textbook shape of a cartel, and it is not a theory whispered by people who want history to be more exciting than it was. It is the documented behavior of real firms managing a real and scarce resource. When you control the supply of the one thing an industry cannot do without, you do not need to own the factories or the workshops. You let other men take the risks of production and the dangers of the poison, and you simply stand at the narrow gate where the essential ingredient passes through, and you take your toll from everyone who needs to pass. The mirror makers, the silverers of New World ore, the makers of scientific instruments, the chemists, all of them came to the same gate, and the gatekeepers grew rich without ever lighting a furnace. Now carry that documented arrangement back across the earlier centuries, before the records were systematic, and you can see the shape of the thing even where the paper has gone dark. The instinct to coordinate, to ration, to set the price together rather than compete it away is not a modern invention. It is as old as scarcity itself. The men who traded mirror mercury in the 17th and 18th centuries did not have the same banking dynasties behind them, but they faced the same temptation, and they answered it the same way, because the logic of a choke point does not change across the ages. Whoever holds the narrow place will be tempted to charge for passage, and whoever holds it together with his rivals will charge more and fight less. The only question history leaves us is how thoroughly they covered their tracks, and in the case of our foundry, the answer appears to be very thoroughly indeed. The threat had a name. It was a chemist's discovery, and like many discoveries that change the shape of an industry, it arrived quietly in a laboratory with no sense of the fortunes it was about to overturn. In the 1830s, a German chemist worked out how to deposit a thin, brilliant layer of pure silver onto the back of a sheet of glass using a chemical bath. No mercury, no tinfoil, no weeks of pressing and waiting, no slow poisoning of the men who did the work. A solution of silver, a reducing agent, a clean pane of glass, and within minutes the surface bloomed into a mirror brighter and clearer than anything the old amalgam had ever produced. Think about what that meant for the men who sat on the mercury. Their entire position rested on the fact that the one irreplaceable ingredient in mirror making could be had from almost nowhere, and that they controlled the almost nowhere. The silver process did not just offer a new technique, it threatened to make their choke point worthless. If mirrors could be made with a splash of silver solution that any competent chemist could mix, then the mine, the cartel, the sealed shipments, the carefully managed annual release, all of it became as valuable as the memory of a river that had changed its course. But industries worth fortunes do not surrender to a better idea overnight. They resist, they delay, they buy time, and they buy patents, and they buy the silence of the men who might spread the new method too quickly. The transition from mercury mirrors to silver mirrors did not happen in a year. It dragged across decades, and the dragging was not an accident of slow adoption. In many places it was managed. The old houses that had grown rich on amalgam mirrors had every reason to slow the spread of a process that needed nothing they controlled, and they had the money to do it. Which brings us at last to the foundry. The records that survive are frustratingly thin, which is itself part of the story, but they point again and again to a single large works that served as the central processing point for mercury destined for the mirror trade across a wide region of the continent. It was not a mine. The mines were elsewhere, in Spain and in the Habsburg lands. This was the place where the raw mercury was received, refined, measured, and distributed onward to the workshops, and where, crucially, the proprietary recipes for the finest amalgam were kept. It was the counting house and the laboratory of the old trade combined under one roof. It was the brain of the monopoly, and like a brain, it held the memory of how everything worked. A monopoly that is dying has a problem that a healthy one does not. Its records become dangerous. The ledgers that proved year after year how the price had been fixed and the supply rationed were a liability the moment the law or a rival might want to see them. The formulas that had been worth a fortune were worth less every season as the silver process spread, and yet they remained evidence of how the old game had been played. And the men who knew the secrets, the master refiners and the senior clerks, were walking liabilities of their own, men who could be bought by a competitor or compelled by a court to testify. On a night in 1881 the Foundry burned. The fire is described in the few accounts that mention it as sudden and total. It began, by one telling, in the section where the mercury was heated, which is plausible enough, because a works that boils a poisonous metal over open furnaces is a dangerous place by nature. Mercury vapour is invisible and heavy and deadly, and a fire in such a building would have been a horror beyond the flames alone, filling the air with a poison that would have made rescue almost impossible. By morning the structure was gone, the ledgers were gone, the formula books were gone, and a number of the men who had worked the process for decades were gone too. Now a single suspicious fire proves nothing. Buildings full of furnaces and volatile chemicals burned with grim regularity in that century, and to leap from a fire to a conspiracy is exactly the kind of careless thinking that gives forgotten history a bad name. So let us be careful. Let us look at what is strange, and let us separate what is strange from what is merely sad. The first strange thing is the timing. The fire came at the precise moment in the long transition when the old Mercury trade had the most to lose from its own records and the least to gain from its own survival. The silver process had matured, the market was turning, the choke point was failing. A monopoly that is winning protects its assets. A monopoly that is losing has a different and darker calculation to make, which is how to exit the game without leaving evidence of how the game was played. The second strange thing is the insurance. The fragmentary records that survive suggest the works was insured for a sum that sat very comfortably above what an aging plant tied to a dying process was worth as a going concern. There is nothing illegal about insuring a property well, but a business that expects a long and profitable future does not generally carry coverage that makes its sudden destruction a financial relief rather than a financial disaster. When a building is worth more burned than standing, the incentives have quietly inverted, and an investigator who ignores that inversion is not being careful. He is being naive. The third strange thing is what happened next. The trade did not collapse with the Foundry. It moved. Within a remarkably short span, the same commercial interests reappeared, reorganized under new arrangements, holding patents and works tied not to the old Mercury amalgam, but to the new silver process. The men who had spent a generation slowing the silver method down were suddenly its proprietors. The choke point had not been destroyed by the fire. It had been relocated and rebuilt on a new foundation, and the fire had conveniently erased the paper trail connecting the old monopoly to the new one. The king was dead. Long live the king. Only now the king sold silver baths instead of mercury, and nobody could prove the throne had ever changed hands by anything other than honest progress. Before we follow the money out of the ashes, we should sit for a moment with the men who made the mirrors, because their bodies are part of the ledger too, and they are the part the cartel most wanted forgotten. The mercury mirror trade did not merely cost money. It cost lives, slowly, in a way that was understood by everyone in the business and admitted by almost no one in public. A man who worked the amalgam tables breathed mercury vapour every day. He pressed the foil in the liquid metal with his bare hands. He bent over the trays for years, and the metal entered him, and it stayed. What it did to him has a name that has survived in the language, even though its origin has mostly been forgotten. Mercury poisoning attacks the nervous system. It begins with a trembling in the hands that the workers called the trembles. It moves to the gums and the teeth. It reaches the mind, and it brings a shyness that curdles into paranoia, a fearfulness, sudden fits of temper, a personality that frays and unravels until the man who once stood steady at the table cannot be trusted with his own thoughts. In the hat-making trade, which used mercury to treat felt, this collapse became so common that the phrase entered the language as a byword for lost reason. The mirror makers suffered the same fate from the same cause, but their version of it never got a famous phrase because the mirror trade was better at keeping its secrets than the hatters ever were. Here is the economic point that turns this human tragedy back into our story. The danger of the work was itself a barrier to entry that protected the monopoly. Mirror making with mercury was not a trade a man could pick up lightly. It required skilled workers willing to trade their health for wages, workshops set up to handle a deadly metal, and a steady supply of that metal from the controlled source. Each of those requirements narrowed the field of who could compete. The poison was, in a cold and terrible sense, good for the men at the top, because it kept the number of producers small, and the secret tightly held among a guild of the doomed. The silver process broke that barrier too. A chemical bath of silver could be handled by a worker who would walk home at the end of the day with his hands steady and his mind his own. The skilled poison guild of the amalgam tables suddenly had nothing rare to sell. Their terrible expertise, bought with their health, was worth nothing in a world that no longer needed it. And so the very workers whose suffering had helped sustain the monopoly were also among its first casualties when it fell, discarded as the trade moved on to cleaner and cheaper methods. When the foundry burned and took some of those men with it, it took with them the living memory of how the old amalgam was truly made. The small adjustments and judgments that no formula book ever fully captured. The fire did not only burn paper, it burned the last heads that held the craft, and a craft that lives only in burned paper and dead men is a craft that cannot be questioned, cannot be audited, and cannot testify against the trade that used it up. There is a phrase that economic historians use for what was happening across the whole of the 19th century, and it fits this story exactly. They call it creative destruction, the process by which a new method sweeps away an old one and builds something better on the rubble. It is usually told as a clean and almost heroic process, the engine of progress. But stand close to it in a single trade, in a single building, on a single night, and the destruction looks a great deal more literal than the textbooks suggest, and far less creative for the men standing inside it when the rubble was made. I want to stop here and do something that the breathless versions of this story never do, because the truth is more interesting than the legend, and because you deserve the honest version. Let me argue against myself for a moment. The conventional history of the mirror is not a lie. The shift from mercury to silver really did happen because the silver process was genuinely better, safer, cheaper, and faster. Mercury mirror making really was a slow poison, and its decline spared the lungs and the minds of countless workers who would otherwise have wasted away with the tremor and the madness that mercury inflicts. The price of mirrors really did fall, and the falling really did put a looking-glass on the wall of the ordinary home for the first time in human history. That is real progress, and no story about cartels and fires should be allowed to erase it. It is also true that documentation from this period is genuinely thin, and that thinness is not always evidence of a cover-up. Fires destroy records because fires destroy records. Insurance was often generous because the risks of industrial work were enormous, and everyone knew it. Companies reorganized constantly in that age of rapid change, and a firm that pivoted from an old process to a new one was not necessarily hiding anything. It might simply have been doing what any sensible business does when the ground shifts beneath it, which is to follow the profit to where the profit has gone. So, which is it? A grand suppression, or an ordinary story of progress dressed up in shadows? The honest answer is that it is almost certainly both, and that the both is the real lesson here. Industries do not need a secret society to behave the way a secret society would behave. A handful of men, each acting in his own clear self-interest, will collectively guard a monopoly, slow a competing technology, ensure a doomed asset, and quietly relocate their capital without a single meeting in a candle-lit room and without ever writing the plan down. The market itself produces the conspiracy. and it produces it so naturally that the men involved may not even experience it as one. They simply do the next sensible thing, and the next, and at the end the records have burned and the choke point has moved and nobody can be blamed, because nobody in the narrow sense did anything wrong. That is the genuinely unsettling idea at the centre of this story, and it is far more durable than any tale of villains. You do not need villains, you need only incentives, and the patience to let them work. The Mercury cartel did not survive for centuries because evil men willed it. It survived because the structure rewarded those who maintained it and punished those who broke ranks. And structures like that are everywhere in economic history, hiding in plain sight behind the word progress. Think then about the mirrors that survived from before that fire. The old looking glasses in the great houses, the ones with the faintly golden cast and the soft, deep reflection that no modern mirror quite reproduces. When you look into one of them, you are looking at the last visible trace of a system that has otherwise vanished from the record. That golden warmth is the Mercury amalgam, the very substance whose supply was owned, rationed, and priced by men whose names most of us will never learn. The glass remembers the trade, even though the ledger's burned. It is the only honest witness left, and it cannot speak. And consider the deeper irony, the one that makes this more than a curiosity. A mirror exists to show you the truth about yourself, plainly, without flattery. It is the household object we trust most completely, to be honest. Yet the history of the mirror itself was, for centuries, one of the least honest stories in the economy, a tale of hidden cartels and guarded secrets, and a fire that cleaned the record at exactly the right moment. The most truthful objects in the house was born of one of the least truthful trades on the continent. We looked into the glass for honesty every single day, never suspecting that the glass had a secret of its own, held in the metal behind the reflection. So the next time you pass a mirror, any mirror, the cheap one in the hallway or an old one in a museum case, let the thought sit with you for a moment. Somewhere behind the everyday miracle of seeing your own face is a chain that runs back through silver baths and burned ledgers, through a foundry that vanished in a single night, through Murano craftsmen forbidden to leave their island, through the sealed shipments of Almaden and the deep galleries of Idrija, all the way back to a red stone the ancients ground into the colour of blood. The reflection is simple. What made it possible never was. That is the story of the Mercury that made the mirrors and the foundry that burned in 1881, carrying its secrets into the smoke. Whether you believe the fire was an accident or something arranged, the lesson underneath does not change. The most ordinary things in our lives often have the least ordinary histories, and the surface that shows us the truth was itself built on a secret. If this story made you see the objects around you a little differently, that is exactly why this channel exists. Stay curious, keep looking past the surface of things, and I will see you in the next one.